Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bio 122 videos from Chapter 34 on digestive system. This is video 15 about the human digestive system. We'll start at the ingestion part of the mouth. And so, as food comes into the mouth, there are actually the beginnings of chemical digestion. There's three major saliva glands. Uh, and they each release an enzyme called salivary amylase, which initiates the digestion of a type of carbohydrate called starch. It's a very difficult to break down carbohydrate, so we actually begin breaking it down immediately. It's not going to be completely broken down into its constituent glucose molecules until it gets into the small intestine. So this is kind of another illustration of how difficult it is to break down carbohydrates, which explains the much more extensive digestive tract of an herbivore because of the need to break down complex carbohydrates. In addition to chemical breakdown, of course, we also have mechanical digestion occurring in the mouth because of the teeth, which we have talked about before, but also the tongue, which is a muscular structure. It's skeletal muscle because it can be voluntarily moved. Uh, and it has the job to do in eating of mixing the food together as it's been chewed by the teeth and forming the mixture into a bolus. So this next slide also illustrates the structure of the tongue, and you see it's actually a lot of muscle. We are probably only familiar, with the very surface of the skin, together with the papillae here, which are the taste sensation. You can kind of see these little bumps here. But all of this is a very strong skeletal muscle that allows the tongue to move around. You should also be familiar, because we're learning this in the fetal pig dissection labs too. The hard palate, which is a bony structure in the front of the mouth that separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. And as we go posterior to that, we end up with the soft palate, which has the ability to flex so that when food comes back to the mouth, the uvula is able, which is the very tip of the soft palate, is able to block the movement of food into the nasal cavity. Now, when we talk about a bolus, this kind of yellowish structure here is representing a clump of food that's been bitten off and chewed, mixed with saliva, which also contains a lot of water. And it is now moved to the back of the mouth where the pharynx is. So let's go back to previous slide talking about pharynx is actually where the digestive and the respiratory systems come together. The soft palate will close off that portion going up to the nasal cavity. So that's called the nasal pharynx. And then we have another flap of soft tissue called the epiglottis that's going to cover the opening into the lungs, which is the trachea. So therefore keeps food from passing into the air passages. So the way the epiglottis works is that there's two portions. The glottis is the lower portion, and the white part here is cartilage. And there's also cartilage up here in the epiglottis. And remember, cartilage is flexible. And so it allows the epiglottis to be moved back and forth. When there's no food in the pharynx, so no solid structure, either liquid or solid, The epiglottis is open as it is here to allow air to go into the trachea. Meanwhile, the esophagus is soft and collapsible. So, and there's actually sphincters here in the esophagus to prevent air from going down the esophagus. It will collapse upon itself. But when a bolus of food comes into the pharynx, it will physically push the epiglottis down to cover up the hole between it and the glottis. So the food will slide down the esophagus, and the esophagus is expandable so that it will allow the movement of solid material or liquid material, and this prevents it from getting into the trachea, at least most of the time. Of course, there's reflex actions here that if food does come into the trachea, it triggers a cough so that it is removed. So now that we're in the esophagus, this bolus of food is actually moved under power from the pharynx down to the stomach by what's called peristalsis, which are rhythmical contractions of the smooth muscle that lines the esophagus. And so it squeezes sequentially to push the bolus down using the smooth muscle contractions. Now, this is a reversible process that allows some animals, like humans, to be able to remove food forcibly from the stomach in the case of vomiting. If there's a toxic substance in there, bacteria, and it's decided by the immune system that it's better just to get it out of the stomach. So it can reverse itself. Not every animal has the ability to do that. One commonly noted that does not have the ability to reverse the movement of food is the rat. So that means rats cannot vomit. That actually means that they're actually very, very careful about what they eat. So then the food gets into the stomach, and the stomach is extremely expandable. In fact, it can fill from almost no volume up to a volume of about 1 liter at a time. It is also a very muscular organ. It's got smooth muscle arranged in 3 different parallel sheets that allows it to contract and kind of squeeze like a churning washing machine. So that allows the stomach to actually perform mechanical digestion by spinning food around. But the epithelial cells that line the stomach, and here is a magnified picture of simple columnar cells that are lining the stomach, but there's also these ridges that form, and this is what allows the stomach to expand rather dramatically. And inside each of these little ridges are these pits, and there are some specialized cells there. One of the cells secretes hydrochloric acid, so hydrogen ions and chloride ions, in order to form the very acidic environment of the stomach. The primary purpose of the acid is, first of all, to potentially kill bacteria and other parasites that may be in the food. So it's actually part of the immune system. Not everything is killed. Many bacteria actually thrive in that environment, but it does take care of a large number of potentially harmful organisms. In addition to the hydrochloric acid, it also secretes an enzyme. The enzyme that's secreted is called pepsinogen. It is a precursor to the hydrolytic enzyme called pepsin. The pepsin works specifically on large protein molecules and breaks the proteins down into smaller peptides. peptide is a molecule with only a few dozen amino acids in a chain, whereas a protein has millions of amino acids. So it does a significant amount of protein digestion in the stomach, and foods will typically remain in the stomach for the time it takes to break the proteins down into smaller constituent particles, smaller peptides. Now, as we continue to churn the food in the stomach and mix it with all the enzymes, when eventually we get down to smaller peptides, that triggers a signal to the brain to trigger the relaxation of the pyloric sphincter, which blocks off the bottom of the stomach from the small intestine. That then allows a small amount of what is now called chyme, which is the partially digested food, to enter into the small intestine, which is where the final digestion takes place and where the absorption of most of the nutrients is going to take place. The very first segment of the small intestine is called the duodenum. And as the food enters, the chyme enters the duodenum, we also add some other critical components, other molecules of the digestive system. First of all, coming from the liver is bile. And the liver produces the bile and can store it in the gallbladder. And bile is not an enzyme. It doesn't specifically do digestion itself, but it is an emulsifier. And what that means is it is like a detergent to allow fat particles to dissolve into the water so that enzymes that are going to be released by the pancreas and by the walls of the small intestine can now actually get into the fatty acids to start breaking them down. Well, the lipids into smaller fatty acids and glycerol. And here is a bigger picture of these two major accessory organs, actually three, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. And the stomach would have been right here, and we have the duct coming from the liver containing bile. It's called the common hepatic duct. Hepatic means liver in Latin. And the bile comes directly into the duodenum, right where the stomach is releasing the chyme into the small intestine. On just the opposite side where the liver is the pancreas. And the pancreas is producing what's called pancreatic juice, but that is the primary enzymes that are going to do the final stages of digestion. In addition, the pancreas is also releasing bicarbonate to neutralize the stomach acid so it doesn't damage the walls of the small intestine. So pancreas, again, is primarily producing three major enzymes. Pancreatic amylase, which is going to do the final breakdown of starches into maltose. Also, trypsin is going to do the final processes of breaking down the peptides into amino acids. Lipases are also going to be breaking down the fat droplets into the final components, which will be glycerol and fatty acids that's going to be finally absorbed into the body. In addition, the epithelial cells of the intestine are also producing several enzymes, again, specifically for peptides and sugars to break them down into glucose, the final steps. So remember, carbohydrates began up in the mouth with salivary amylase. And so this again kind of illustrates how difficult and how many steps have to take place and how long it's going to take to finally get carbohydrates broken down into glycerol, assuming that it's a complex carbohydrate. A simple sugar will break down incredibly rapidly. Uh, so, as we get into the small intestine, once we have finished digestion and breaking the larger food particles into glucose, so all carbohydrates will end up becoming just simple molecules of glucose. All the proteins will end up becoming simple molecules of amino acids. All of the fats will end up becoming simple molecules of uh, glycerol and fatty acids. And at that point, we uh, are continuing along the small intestine, and instead of digestion, we switch over to absorption process. So that means we're absorbing things into the blood, and so we have an extensive circulatory system, blood vessels surrounding the small intestine. You'll see that when doing your anatomy work with the fetal pig, the mesenteric blood vessels. And if we were to open up the small intestine, we see villi. Villi is the Latin word for hills. So these are small hills. And then if we zoom in even more over here, we see that there's actually microvilli. So we have an incredible increase in surface area. And this cartoon picture showing individual epithelial cells, that's being shown right here is kind of these rectangular things with the nucleus in it. Underlying that are capillaries with interconnecting the arteries and the veins. So blood is being delivered to the small intestine through the arteries. They branch into capillaries, and there is only one layer of columnar, simple columnar epithelial cells that do a controlled diffusion of very specific items, glucose, amino acids, fat, and fatty acids, into the actual body itself. So that's the process of absorption. And the water soluble molecules, so that means the amino acids and the glucose and the water soluble vitamins will move directly into the blood supply. But you also notice this green structure coming up, and that color coding is for the lymphatic capillaries. This is the lymphatic system, which is known as your immune system. But one of the other jobs of the lymphatic system is that it provides the primary absorption of fatty acids and glycerol into the body, because fatty acids are not dissolvable into water without some processing. They need to be attached to proteins to carry them. And so the lymphatic system is actually the way in which the fat molecules, so fatty acids and glycerol, actually get brought into the body initially. Okay, so we end up getting everything absorbed in the small intestine. And then by the time we move to the large intestine, there's only a little bit of absorption left of nutrients, mostly some of the salts, so sodium, chloride, potassium, so those are also known as the minerals, and a few vitamins will be absorbed in the large intestine. But primarily, what we're doing in the large intestine is reabsorbing the water, the massive amounts of water that we had been adding to the chyme in the stomach, and then in the mouth with the saliva, and in addition in the small intestine as we're adding the pancreatic juices. So we're trying to recover that water so we don't waste water. Now, As this continues along, right where the small intestine joins up with the large intestine is where the human cecum used to be. And remember, the cecum is used by animals that need to break down carbohydrates. We are left with just a very small portion of the cecum and forming what we now refer to as the appendix. Really doesn't perform significant function in digestive system, but we do have numerous bacteria, so the so-called probiotics that now live in the small intestine, in addition in this portion of the cecum, that do a similar thing with breaking down cellulose that you see in herbivores, but we don't really use that material for nutrition. Instead, it's food for the bacteria. But what the bacteria do is they actually create some of our vitamins, specifically vitamin K is produced by bacteria in the large intestine. So that will be absorbed and used as a nutrient. Okay. So to kind of summarize this portion of absorption, um, there's two major portions, and I like this cartoon down here, which shows starting in the mouth, going to the anus, the different compartmentalizations that occur. The purple areas indicating the secretions that come from the saliva gland. So, of course, that's going to contain salivary amylase to break down starches. The secretions from the gastric glands, which would include the hydrochloric acid and pepsin to break down proteins, and then secretions from the pancreas that will include bicarbonate to neutralize the stomach acid, but also the major digestive enzymes to break down fats, lipids, and the remaining steps of breaking down proteins, and then secretions from the liver, which is bile. So all of these things are being added, but the first thing that gets broken down after the bile gets added, fats are very, very easy to digest. Uh, Basically, we just do nothing to the fats until we add bile, and then the enzymes in the pancreas really quickly convert the fats into uh, fatty acids and glycerol, and then they are going to be absorbed into the lymphatic system, which will eventually drop them off into the subclavian veins that are leading to the heart. So it will all end up in the circulatory system, but the lymphatic system is specifically designed to carry the lipids into the blood. Everything else, so that would be the amino acids, glucose, vitamins, minerals, and water, are going to be absorbed in the latter portion of the small intestine because it is going to require a bit more processing and digestion of these things compared to the lipids. And so then they will be absorbed into the veins that are surrounding the small intestine. All of those form in what's called the hepatic portal vein, which carries the blood from the small intestine to the liver. And we also end up absorbing water from the large intestine, and again, a few vitamins, which also gets added to the hepatic portal vein. So that means the liver is in position to kind of what we call have a first pass, which means the liver is going to take all of the stuff that's been absorbed from the intestines and then check it and neutralize any potential toxins that may have come in, and starts redistributing where the amino acids and the glucose and everything is going to go. So the liver has a lot of control over what comes in as a nutrient, because then from that point, it's going to go out to the rest of the body in the circulatory system. Okay, so this concludes a basic summary of the steps of digestion in the human. The next lecture, we're going to start talking about exactly what these nutrients are and why they're necessary. Okay, good day.